Have you ever read a science textbook and thought, something feels missing? Like the textbook gives you the facts, the dates, the names, the discoveries, but it never tells you the wild part. It doesn't tell you about the woman who hand-stitched the software that landed us on the moon. It doesn't tell you about an entire city of 75,000 people, so secret it didn't appear on any map. It doesn't tell you about the 11-year-old girl who discovered something that scientists had been searching for decades. Science history is full of stories like this. Stories so surprising, so genuinely hard to believe, that they got quietly left out of the textbooks. Over the next hour, I'm going to take you through 8 of the most incredible hidden science stories in history. All of them are real, all of them verified, and every single one of them starts with an ordinary person who did something extraordinary. Let's go. Chapter 1. Margaret Hamilton. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. It is one of the most famous moments in human history. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. That mission, Apollo 11, came within 3 minutes of being cancelled completely. Not because of a rocket failure, not because of bad weather, because of a computer alarm. As the lunar module descended toward the moon's surface, an alarm started going off. 1202, 1202, over and over. The astronauts didn't know what it meant. Mission Control didn't know what it meant. And with 3 minutes until touchdown, a 26-year-old woman named Margaret Hamilton had to make a decision that would determine whether Neil Armstrong ever walked on that moon. Let me back up. When NASA started planning the moon mission in the early 1960s, they needed someone to write the software that would guide the spacecraft. In 1965, software wasn't considered a serious scientific discipline. There was no textbook, no previous mission to learn from, no roadmap of any kind. NASA handed the software job to a small team led by Margaret Hamilton, a mathematician who had never written spacecraft software before. Nobody had. She basically had to invent the entire discipline of flight software engineering from scratch. Margaret Hamilton coined the term software engineering herself. Before her, it wasn't even called that. She fought to have software treated as seriously as any other engineering discipline. She and her team wrote 145,000 lines of code by hand. No computers to help write it, no copy and paste, no undo button. Every single line, by hand. And she built something into the software that nobody had asked for, something she invented herself because she thought it might someday be needed. She called it priority display. Basically, it was a system that allowed the computer to recognize when it was being overloaded with tasks and automatically drop the less important ones to focus on what was critical. Nobody asked her to build this. The engineers said it wasn't necessary. She built it anyway. And that brings us back to July 20th, 1969. 3 minutes before touchdown. The 1202 alarm. A checklist error before launch had left a radar system running that was supposed to be off. That radar was flooding the computer with data it didn't need. The computer was being overloaded. And in exactly that situation, Margaret Hamilton's uninvited, nobody asked for priority display system kicked in. The computer dropped the unnecessary data, kept the critical data, kept flying. The astronauts landed safely on the moon. 3 minutes later, Margaret Hamilton received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The photo NASA released of her standing next to her printed code, has become one of the most famous science images in history. The stack of paper is taller than she is. That is the code that landed us on the moon, written by hand, by someone who had to invent the entire field first. Chapter 2. Oak Ridge. Quick question. What is the most important city in American science history? Most people would say Washington, D.C., or Cape Canaveral, maybe Houston. Almost nobody would say Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But they should, because Oak Ridge is one of the most astonishing places in the entire history of science. And for 3 years during World War II, it officially didn't exist. In 1942, the United States was racing to develop the world's first atomic weapon, and the scientists working on it faced an enormous problem. To build an atomic weapon, you needed enriched uranium, and to enrich uranium, you needed a factory, a very big factory, a factory so big it would need its own power grid, its own roads, its own schools, its own hospitals, essentially, its own city. But this city had to be completely secret. If enemy spies discovered where they were building it, the entire mission could be compromised. So in 1942, the US government quietly purchased 60,000 acres of farmland in eastern Tennessee. They knocked on doors of families who had lived there for generations. They said, "Pack your things. You have 2 weeks to leave." And then they started building. Within a year, a city of 75,000 people existed in those Tennessee hills. Bigger than Knoxville was at the time. Roads, schools, hospitals, factories, grocery stores, movie theaters, a swimming pool, an entire functioning city. That did not appear on any map. If you worked there and someone asked where you worked, you said nothing. Not because you had to, because you genuinely didn't know what you were building. The vast majority of the 75,000 people who lived and worked in Oak Ridge had absolutely no idea what they were building. They were told only what they needed to know to do their specific job. Historians call this compartmentalization. Each person only knew their piece. Nobody knew the whole puzzle. And it worked. For 3 years, 75,000 people lived and worked in a city that didn't officially exist. None of them told anyone. None of them leaked the secret. After the war, the gates of Oak Ridge opened for the first time. And the people who had spent years not being allowed to tell their families where they were could finally say, "I was here. This is what we built. This is what we did." Today, Oak Ridge is a real open city in Tennessee with a publicly visible address. The National Museum of Science and Energy is there, telling the full story of what happened in those hills. And the next time someone tells you a secret can't be kept. 75,000 people kept one for 3 years in a city that didn't exist. Chapter 3. Harvard Computers and Venetia Burney. I want to tell you about a girl named Venetia Burney. In 1930, Venetia was 11 years old. She lived in Oxford, England, and one morning over breakfast, her grandfather read her a news article saying scientists had just discovered a new object at the edge of our solar system. They hadn't named it yet, and Venetia said, without really thinking about it, "How about Pluto?" Now here's where the story gets amazing. Venetia's grandfather had connections. He called a professor friend at Oxford who was on the committee that names astronomical objects. The professor loved it. He sent it to the astronomers in America who had discovered the new object. They loved it too. And on May 1st, 1930, the new object at the edge of our solar system was officially named Pluto. after a suggestion from an 11-year-old girl eating breakfast with her grandfather. But here is the hidden science story underneath. Why was there a new object to name at all? The answer involves a woman named Henrietta Swan Leavitt, and another woman named Annie Jump Cannon, and a third named Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin, three scientists whose work was so foundational that without them, we might not have found Pluto for another decade. In the early 1900s, the Harvard Observatory hired a group of women to catalog and analyze thousands of photographic plates of stars. They were called the Harvard computers. They were paid 25 cents an hour. They weren't considered scientists by most of their colleagues. They were considered human calculators. But they discovered things that changed everything we know about space. Henrietta Swan Leavitt discovered the relationship between a star's brightness and its pulsation period, giving astronomers the first reliable tool to measure distances across the universe. Without her work, we had no way of knowing how far away anything in space actually was. Annie Jump Cannon classified over 350,000 stars by hand, creating the stellar classification system that astronomers still use today. Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin discovered that stars are made mostly of hydrogen and helium. When she submitted her findings, a senior astronomer told her she was wrong and pressured her to change her conclusion. She changed it in print, but noted in her paper that she believed her original findings were correct. 20 years later, the same astronomer published the same finding and received full credit for it. Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin's discovery, the composition of stars, is now considered one of the most important findings in the history of astronomy. The Harvard computers worked in the background. Their names were mostly forgotten. But the foundation they built is what allowed scientists to map the solar system well enough to find Pluto in the first place. Today, 5 craters on Pluto are named after the Harvard computers. The universe has a long memory, even when history does not. Chapter 4. Operation Paperclip. Here is a question that sounds simple, but has a wild answer. How did America go from not having rocket technology to landing on the moon in just 24 years? The answer involves a secret so big, the government kept it classified for over 50 years. When World War II ended in 1945, American military officers swept through Germany looking for anything useful, and they found something extraordinary. Germany had been developing rocket technology far beyond anything that existed anywhere else in the world. The V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, had been launched over 3,000 times during the war. It could travel over 200 miles. It hit the edge of space. It flew faster than the speed of sound. Nothing like it had ever been built before, and the scientists who built it were right there in Germany. Under a secret program called Operation Paperclip, more than 1,600 German scientists and their families were quietly brought to the United States, given new addresses, new paperwork, and jobs working for the American military, and eventually NASA. The most famous was a man named Wernher von Braun. In Germany, he had been the lead engineer on the V-2 rocket program. Brilliant. He had been dreaming about space travel since he was a teenager, reading science fiction novels and building rockets in his backyard. He didn't want to build weapons. He wanted to go to space. When American soldiers found von Braun in 1945, he had already decided to surrender to the Americans. He believed they were more likely to eventually pursue space exploration. He was brought to the United States and put to work on American rockets. Then the space race started. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957. America was behind. The pressure was enormous. President Kennedy stood up in 1961 and said, "We will land a man on the moon before the end of this decade." The rocket that would make it possible was called the Saturn V. It remains the most powerful rocket ever successfully launched in human history. 363 feet tall, 7.6 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. Designed by Wernher von Braun. On July 16, 1969, Saturn V launched Apollo 11 toward the moon. Von Braun stood in the control room watching the launch. He was crying. He had been dreaming about this moment since he was a teenager, reading science fiction in his bedroom in Germany. He never imagined the path from there to here would be so complicated or so long. Operation Paperclip remained classified for decades. The full story wasn't publicly confirmed until the 1990s. But the science is undeniable. The rocket that took humans to the moon was built by a team of scientists who started their careers building rockets in Germany. In a program so secret, most Americans never knew it existed. Until now. Chapter 5, Invisible Ink. Here is a science story that sounds like something out of a spy movie. During World War I, intelligence agencies on both sides were desperately searching for better ways to send secret messages. Codes were useful, but codes could be broken. What if you could send a message in plain sight that nobody could even see? Invisible ink had existed for centuries. Lemon juice, milk, vinegar. All of them create invisible messages that appear when heated. Every spy agency in the world knew about them, which meant every spy agency in the world knew how to detect them. What scientists needed was a truly invisible ink, something that couldn't be detected by heat, chemicals, or any known method. An American scientist named Dr. Stanley Collins may have found it. He worked for military intelligence during World War I, tasked with developing better chemical tools for secret communication. He discovered a compound, the exact formula of which remained classified for decades, that was truly invisible under all known detection methods of the time. Messages written with his formula were being passed across enemy lines in letters that looked completely ordinary. Love letters, business correspondence, family updates, all of it carrying military intelligence that nobody could detect. The formula worked because it exploited a gap in the detection science of the time. Early detection methods relied on heat, which reveals organic inks by burning them slightly. Collins found a compound that didn't react to heat in a visible way and didn't respond to known chemical washes. It was a scientific solution to a scientific problem. The gap between what you can hide and what can be detected is always exactly as wide as the gap in scientific knowledge. Today, the science of invisible ink has evolved into an entire field called steganography, the art of hiding information in plain sight. Modern digital versions can hide entire files inside ordinary-looking photos. The science that started with lemon juice and a warm iron now protects digital secrets all over the world. Chapter 6, Animal Astronauts. Before any human ever left Earth's atmosphere, animals went first. Most people know about Laika, the Soviet space dog who orbited Earth in 1957. But the full history of animal astronauts is far stranger and far more scientifically important than most people realize. Let's start with the fruit flies. In 1947, 12 years before Laika, the United States launched fruit flies into space on a captured German V-2 rocket. And this wasn't a joke or an accident. Fruit flies share about 75% of the genes that cause disease in humans. Their DNA responds to radiation in ways similar enough to human DNA to give scientists useful data, and they reproduce quickly enough to observe effects across multiple generations in a short time. The fruit flies were launched to an altitude of 68 miles, beyond the boundary of Earth's atmosphere. They experienced about 3 minutes of weightlessness and exposure to cosmic radiation. The capsule was recovered in the New Mexico desert. The flies were alive, and their DNA was intact. This was the first scientific data ever collected on the biological effects of space travel. It told scientists that living cells could survive a short trip through the radiation and weightlessness of space. Without those fruit flies, scientists would have had no biological baseline at all when planning the first human missions. After the fruit flies came the monkeys. The United States sent a series of monkeys into space throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. The data collected about breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and neurological function under spaceflight conditions directly informed how NASA designed life support systems for human astronauts. But my favorite animal astronaut story involves a chimpanzee named Ham. On January 31st, 1961, Ham became the first great ape to travel in space. He was 3 years old. He had been trained to push levers in response to lights, so scientists could measure whether a primate could actually function and respond to instructions under the stress of spaceflight. During the flight, which lasted about 16 minutes, Ham performed his tasks correctly. His reaction times were barely different from what they had been on Earth. This proved that a primate, a creature with brain functions similar enough to humans to be a useful comparison, could think, respond, and perform tasks under actual spaceflight conditions. 3 months after Ham's mission, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Ham lived for another 26 years after his mission. He spent his retirement at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. When he died in 1983, he was buried with full honors at the New Mexico Museum of Space History. The animal astronauts went first, so that humans could follow safely. Science remembers them, even when history doesn't. Chapter 7. Camp Century. In 1959, the United States Army Corps of Engineers did something that sounds completely impossible. They built a city under the ice of Greenland. A working, functioning city with roads, laboratories, a hospital, a church, a movie theater, running water and electricity, all of it buried under 35 feet of solid ice in one of the most remote places on Earth. In less than 2 years, the project was called Camp Century, and officially it existed to study whether it was possible to operate in extreme Arctic conditions. The actual purpose was more interesting. Camp Century was a test site for a plan called Project Iceworm. The Army wanted to build a network of tunnels stretching over 2,500 miles under Greenland's ice sheet and store and launch nuclear missiles inside them. The missiles would be constantly moving through the tunnels, making them almost impossible for an enemy to target. A moving city of missiles, hidden under one of the most remote ice sheets on the planet. At its peak, about 200 soldiers lived there. The ice tunnels stretched for miles. They drilled an ice core, a cylindrical sample bored from deep inside the ice sheet, that turned out to be one of the most scientifically valuable discoveries of the entire Cold War. Not for military reasons, for climate science reasons. That ice core contained trapped air bubbles from ancient atmospheres stretching back 800,000 years. 800,000 years of Earth's atmospheric history, frozen in ice, pulled out of the ground by Army engineers who were looking for missile launch sites. Those bubbles are how scientists first developed detailed knowledge of how Earth's climate has changed over hundreds of thousands of years. The data from Camp Century's ice cores helped build the foundation of modern climate science. Discovered entirely by accident, while building a secret military base under the ice, Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. The camp was buried under the ice, and for decades it sat there, completely forgotten, under 100 feet of Greenland ice. In 2016, a NASA radar flight over Greenland picked up an unusual heat signature. Scientists investigated. They had found Camp Century, sitting exactly where it had been left in 1967, frozen in time under the ice. A Cold War secret buried so effectively it took a NASA satellite 50 years to find it. Chapter 8, Alfred Wegener. I want to end with a story about science itself. In 1912, a German scientist named Alfred Wegener published a theory. He proposed that the continents of Earth, North America, South America, Europe, Africa, all of them, had once been connected. One giant supercontinent. He called it Pangaea. And he said that over millions of years, the continents had slowly drifted apart to their current positions. The scientific community's response was immediate. They said, "This is ridiculous. Continents don't move. They are massive solid pieces of rock sitting on the surface of the Earth. There is no force powerful enough to move them. There is no mechanism that could explain it." Wegener was laughed at. His theory was rejected by almost every major geological institution in the world. He died in 1930 on an expedition in Greenland, still defending his theory, still rejected. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, scientists began exploring the ocean floor, and they found something extraordinary. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there is a massive underwater mountain range called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and along the center of that ridge, new rock is being constantly created. Molten rock from deep inside the Earth is pushing up through the ocean floor, cooling and spreading outward. Spreading. The ocean floor itself is moving, slowly, over millions of years, but unmistakably moving. Alfred Wegener had been right. The continents do move. The force he couldn't identify was the movement of the ocean floor itself, what scientists now call plate tectonics. His theory, ridiculed for 50 years, became one of the most important frameworks in all of science. But here is the hidden lesson inside this story. How did Wegener first notice this? He looked at a map, and he noticed that the eastern coastline of South America fits almost perfectly against the western coastline of Africa, like puzzle pieces, like they had once been connected. He said, "That can't be a coincidence," and he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out why. Every young person watching this has looked at a map of the world. Most of them have probably noticed that South America and Africa look like they fit together, and most of them probably thought, that's weird, and then moved on. Alfred Wegener didn't move on. He pulled on that thread. He kept asking why. He built a theory, got rejected, kept defending it, died before he was proven right, and changed science forever. The lesson is not that experts are always wrong. Most of the time, experts know things that are genuinely true and important. The lesson is that science is a process of asking. And the most powerful question in the universe, the question that has driven every discovery in every chapter of this video, is a simple one. Why? Margaret Hamilton asked. Why don't we make this software more reliable? The scientists at Oak Ridge asked, why can't we build something that has never been built before? Venetia Burney asked, why not name it Pluto? Werner von Braun asked, why can't humans go to space? Alfred Wegener asked, why do those coastlines match? All of science, all of discovery, all of human progress starts with someone looking at the world and asking, why? And refusing to stop until they find out. Closing. 8 stories. A programmer who invented software engineering to land us on the moon. A city of 75,000 people that didn't exist on any map. A group of women calculators who mapped the entire universe for 25 cents an hour. A secret program that brought rocket scientists to America and started the space race. An invisible ink that fooled an entire war. Fruit flies and chimpanzees who went to space before any human dared to. A Cold War military base buried under Arctic ice that accidentally discovered 800,000 years of climate history. And a scientist who spent his whole life being laughed at and was right the entire time. None of these stories were in my textbook, but all of them are real. All of them changed the world. All of them began with a person who looked at something everyone else had ignored and decided to find out why. Science never stops. And neither does the history we haven't found yet. If you want more hidden science history, subscribe. Every week, more stories they forgot to teach you. See you next time.